Majora's Mask is probably one of the more unique entries in the Zelda series, and often overshadowed by Ocarina of Time. However, recently it seems that fandom for Majora's Mask is on the rise as more and more people are praising how good Majora's Mask is, and even saying how it is the best in the Zelda series. But is Majora's Mask worthy of the praise it is receiving, or is it overrated? Unlike most games in the Zelda series, Majora's Mask is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, and follows Link's journey as he explores the mysterious land of Termina. While looking for his lost friend, Link is ambushed by the Skull Kid, who uses the power of Majora's Mask to turn Link into a Deku Scrub. Link winds up in Clock Town, where he meets the Happy Mask salesman, who tells him about the dangers of the mask and how the Skull Kid must be stopped in order to prevent the moon from crashing into Termina. Eventually, Link is able to recover his ocarina and transform himself back. Link then goes out to find the 4 giants who can stop the moon and allow Link to recover the mask. Unlike most Zelda games, story-wise, Majora's Mask is the lightest, as there isn't as much narration as storytelling. Instead, the game expects you to talk to the other Denzians of Termina, and do the various side quests that they offer to learn more about the land. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as players who put more effort into the game will get more out of it, but it does mean that players who only focus on the main story will really lose out on a lot of content. Gameplay-wise, Majora's Mask is unique in that Link has 4 different forms: Human, Deku, Goron, and Zora. Each form has their own unique playstyle and moves, but they all suffer from stiff and rigid controls. For example, in human form, Link controls just as he did in Ocarina of Time, which means he suffers from the same inflexibility in combat. In Deku Scrub form, when Link enters pink and gold flowers, movement is hampered as it's difficult to turn at all, and the camera controls are downright retarded, as the camera gets stuck at weird angles, making flying next to impossible, and sometimes it's difficult to tell if you're hovering over a platform. Goron Link's problem is with his roll attack, as it has a slow start and you need a clear path in front of you in order to gain enough momentum. The roll is also hard to maneuver around turns, and moving on thin strips of land is next to impossible without falling off. Finally, Zora Link's problem is that his boomerang fins have a knack for hitting walls instead of enemies. Not only that, but swimming in close quarters usually causes you to run into walls, which ends up stunning you for a second, and again, sometimes the camera fucks up and focuses in front of Link instead of behind him. The one thing I noticed while playing the game again is how often you have to switch forms. This gets really annoying, as putting on and taking off the mask has an animation of usually 5 seconds. You can skip the animation, but it's not an instantaneous switch like it is with the other masks. Like I said earlier, the camera and even the targeting system in the game can be very frustrating to use. The camera can only be centered behind Link, which makes it hard to see when you're trying to angle yourself to be able to climb up onto a platform, and you can't see it because the platform is in the way. The camera also seems to have a problem focusing itself behind Link, and sometimes you're forced to stare at his face until the camera decides to fix itself. For some reason, I also had a lot of problems with the targeting system, where Tata would lock onto an enemy, but I wouldn't until I passed the enemy, and I usually had to hit the targeting button several times before I would lock onto something. Now, whether this was just because this game is outdated, or if this is because it is really bad, is up for debate, but I can't really excuse how faulty it is if this is being compared to other games in the Zelda series. Unlike other Zelda games, Majora's Mask runs on a 3-day cycle, which roughly translates to about an hour in real life. Basically, you have 3 days in order to complete a side quest or run through a temple before you have to rewind time and start all over from day 1. You can slow down time in order to give yourself 3 hours instead of the 1, and you can also skip ahead time to the night and dawn of each day. Now, this sounds like an interesting concept, however, in execution it doesn't work out so well. The problem in the execution is that you constantly feel rushed in whatever you are trying to do. I get that the game is trying to create a sense of urgency, seeing as how the moon is going to destroy all of Termina in 3 days, but for me, I really couldn't enjoy any of the areas or temples because I was constantly worried about completing as much as possible before I had to go back to the first day. There's also the fact that you will constantly have to repeat things you've already done. In the beginning of the game, you spend your first 3 days waiting for the clock tower to open in order for you to get back your ocarina from the Skull Kid, so you can change yourself back into a human. Now, while you wait for the clock tower to open, you'll need to find the missing fairy and bring it back to the Great Fairy, North Clocktown. You'll need to gain access to the observatory, so you'll need to play hide and seek with the bombers, and you'll need to get the moon tier and bring it back to the business scrub so you can gain access to the clock tower. Now after you get back your ocarina and turn yourself back into a human, you'll have to do all these quests over again. No, seriously, it's basically like the first hour of gameplay was just to waste your time. They could have given you the Great Fairy Mask the first time you visit the fairy, and they could have just as easily given you the Bomber's Notebook, but they didn't, which means you have to go through and do both quests over again. This also happens with the boss in Snowhead Temple, as there are several quests that could only be completed after beating the boss. Now maybe some people don't have a problem with having to repeat quests over again, but for me this just seems incredibly lazy and an artificial way to extend the length of the game. Another problem with the 3-day cycle is that the only way to save your game is to return to the dawn of the first day. There's a temporary save feature you can use, but you're immediately sent back to the title screen, and progress isn't really saved until you play the Song of Time. Because of this, you basically have to sit through and play the game for an hour the first time through, since you can't save until you get your ocarina. You can't even make a temporary save, as you can't even activate the owl statue without a sword. The real problem with this though is this. No, there's nothing wrong with the video, my game froze while I was doing the Couples Mask quest. And also here, when I was about to fight Majora, both places where it is impossible to save the game, and in both cases I lost about an hour of playtime. And this right here is the problem with the saving feature in this game. There's too big of a chance to lose progress in the game because there's a chance that the game can end up freezing. Would it really have been so hard to have the save files make permanent saves? I mean, I really don't see how that would have negatively impacted the gameplay at all. Like most other games, Link can have a total of 20 heart containers, and since he starts with 3 and only gets 4 more, that leaves 13 heart containers unaccounted for. The rest of the heart containers can be collected by finding the pieces of heart, all 52 of them. Just for reference, even Twilight Princess, which made it so you had to collect 5 pieces of heart to get a full heart container, only had 45 pieces of heart. In order to get all the pieces of heart, Majora's Mask has a variety of minigames and side quests that you can play. Besides pieces of heart, some quests will also reward players with a mask. The problem I have with these side quests and minigames is that they feel like filler. And for some reason, a lot involve picking up collectibles. And Jesus, there are a ton of fucking collectibles in this game. There are masks, bottles, fairies, gold skeletas, Zora eggs, rupees, land titles, baby chicks, and even frogs. There's even a whole quest revolving around collecting items to give to Gibdos in order to get the mirror shield. Others involve shooting targets with your bow, as if the bow wasn't used enough in this game. There are about 7 minigames where you have to shoot targets. Even one of the minigames at the Honey and Darling Gallery involves target shooting with the bow, and there's a fucking bomb above the door. Could they really not come with another bomb-based minigame? Overall, because the minigames and side missions are such a large part of the game, and because so many of them are similar, it just gets incredibly boring after a while, which is really disappointing considering this is such a large part of the game. One of the big draws of Majora's Mask are the masks. In the game there are 24 masks to collect, 4 that transform Link and 20 that only human Link can wear. Now all the masks have some ability that wearing them bestows upon Link, however most of the masks are really only needed for one event and after that they are completely useless. Going through the masks, I say that only the Great Fairy Mask, Stone Mask, Bunny Hood, and Gibdo and/or Captain's Hat masks are really useful as they can be used in multiple situations. Now there is a reward for collecting every mask, which is the Fierce Deity's mask. However, it can only be worn in boss rooms, and even then you can only use it on 3 out of the 5 bosses. One of my biggest problems with this game is the dungeons. First off, Majora's Mask has the fewest, with there only being 4. I really don't understand why there are only 4 when this game came out 2 years after Ocarina of Time, which had 8 main dungeons. So why did this game have half as many? Was it because this game was rushed and they didn't have time to build more? Was it because of the time cycle in the game? Or was it because of the story, as in they couldn't think of a reason to include more than 4? Well, whatever the reason, the fact remains that because there are so few dungeons, the game seems to be filled with a lot of extra fluff because of it. Another problem I have with the dungeons is the layout of them. While playing through each dungeon, I got the feeling that they were designed to be confusing, and meant to make you waste your time by having to constantly backtrack. Now backtracking isn't necessarily new, as most of the games have players revisit old rooms once they found the key, or the item needed to proceed through the dungeon. However, in this case, each dungeon seemed like a confusing labyrinth. Case in point, the Snowhead Temple. This temple was so frustrating because of how often I would fall off a ledge and have to go all the way back to the start of the level just to make my way back up to where I was. Another thing I noticed was that I really didn't remember anything about any of the dungeons. Seeing as how this was the third time I played Majora's Mask, you'd think I would remember something about the dungeons, but nope, they were just as confusing this time around as they had been on previous playthroughs. I don't know if this was because the dungeons are completely forgettable or if it's because I had to rush through each time I played, but I think that says something about the quality of your game when it has 4 temples and none of them make an impact on the player. Some of you are probably saying that there are 5 dungeons in the game, with the moon being the 5th one, but honestly the moon's dungeon is really just 4 obstacle courses, and I'd hardly call that a dungeon. Not only that, but it's completely optional. Moving on to the bosses, like the dungeons, the bosses in the game were very disappointing. However, the disappointment didn't come from their lack of innovation, but from their execution. For most of the bosses, again, I feel like a broken record for saying it, but the targeting system and controls seem to really hamper the boss battles. And although all the boss fights were unique, I found that none of them were as fun as other bosses in the Zelda series. For instance, I had a lot of problems while fighting Goat. As Goron Link, it was difficult to roll around as attacks would constantly hit me. Even if I wasn't hit, I would usually abruptly stop rolling and then have to restart rolling again. I also tried shooting the boss with fire arrows from the doorway, and although it was much easier, it took forever and was just plain boring. With Yorg, whenever I shot my boomerang fins at him, one of the fins would always get stuck in the stage. I also found it incredibly difficult to get out of the water without getting eaten by him, which was incredibly annoying seeing as how the game only gives you about 5 seconds to get out. The Twin Mole battle was also a complete mess as I couldn't lock on with the fairy, and my sword was constantly bouncing off the boss's body. I honestly couldn't even tell if I was hitting his weak spot or how many times I hit his weak spot until he just kind of exploded. I honestly think the boss fight would have been better if the boss was scaled down to normal size, seeing as how the boss and Link being giant really didn't add anything to the fight. Finally, the last boss is Majora's Mask itself. There are several ways to go about fighting this boss, as you can do it normally or with the Fierce Deity's Mask. In order to get the Fierce Deity's Mask, you must collect all 20 of the masks in the game and complete the 4 obstacle courses on the moon. The problem with the Fierce Deity's Mask is that it is way overpowered. If you get the mask, you can take out Majora in less than a minute. Seriously, the cutscenes for Majora's transformations take longer. This is disappointing because usually the final boss is supposed to be this grand battle, and is usually supposed to have some semblance of difficulty, but that's completely taken away by how powerful the Fierce Deity's Mask is. I also decided to fight Majora without using the Fierce Deity's Mask, and without unlimited magic, to see if it was any more difficult, and honestly, it still wasn't that much of a challenge. I didn't die or need to use a potion to recover health or magic. If anything, I found this boss fight annoying, seeing as how it was difficult to lock on with the targeting system, and every attack made Link fall on his ass. But other than that, this boss fight paled in comparison to any other final boss in the Zelda series. Looking at the items in the game, one strange thing that I didn't realize until later was how every item you found in the dungeons was based around the bow. The first dungeon gave you the bow, and the second you got the fire arrows, and the third you got the ice arrows, and finally in the fourth you got the light arrows. Because of this, basically every puzzle was solvable by either one of the masks or your bow. Obviously there are other items in the game that return from the Ocarina of Time, like bombs, magic beans, and the Lens of Truth, as well as new items like the potted keg and Picto Box. However, I found that most of the items were only used or needed like twice throughout the whole game. I know Majora's Mask isn't the only game that has somewhat useless items, but I was surprised how few times I actually used anything besides the bow. I mean, I didn't even know that bomb trees were even in this game until I looked at the item screen and saw a blank spot. And the only place you need to use one is in the optional obstacle course on the moon. I mean, really? Why even have it in the game if they're completely useless? The same could be said for the magic beans in the Picto Box, as they're only needed twice. Even the Lens of Truth is really only used right after you obtain it and in one other optional cave. To me, it just seems like they phoned in the items and took existing assets from Ocarina of Time to put in the game and then barely used them. Even with all the technical problems that this game has, I think the main reason I believe that this game is overrated is the fandom. The reason is that a lot of fans have taken it upon themselves to infer and speculate some crazy theories based off set pieces and the information that the game presents. Now, some of this fan speculation is kind of interesting to read, however my problem with it is that it's not really based on anything other than people making loose connections between images on set pieces and different interpretations of what events in the game mean. It could be possible that this game is an analogy for the stages of grief, But I think a more likely story is that it's just about some kid preventing a calamity and people are just reading too much into things. Why this is so bothersome is that it really plays up the game as something that it isn't. When someone who hasn't played Majora's Mask hears how it's such a great game because of how deep and philosophical it is, it sets people up for disappointment, as when they actually play the game, all they see is a 10-year-old kid trying to stop some asshole who's hell-bent on destruction. I know it seems like I'm just shitting all over this game, but I do think there are some cool and interesting scenes in the game. When calling on the giants, the music and the giants working together to stop the moon from falling is incredibly cool. The scene at the end of the Couples Mask quest was Anju waiting for Cafe, even though the moon is going to fall and destroy Clocktown, and when Cafe finally returns and they both combine masks, is a pretty moving scene. Also, the time travel mechanic and mask transformations are really unique concepts. However, that's really not enough to excuse the technical and poor execution of these ideas. So is this game overrated? Yeah, I'd say so. I think the fandom has really played up what this game is about and how good some of the elements of this game really are. Not only that, but Majora's Mask repeats too many gameplay elements, which makes the game feel redundant.